Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm a regionally renowned trivia master from southeastern South Dakota, and your host today, Doug Kroneisel. Thank you so much for being with us. Most public school K-12 students in the U.S. attend a school based primarily on their residential address, and that dividing line can often determine the quality of the public education available to them. These boundaries link public education to many facets of family residential decisions, including wealth, ethnicity, social connection, employment, social status. Last year, Ballotpedia embarked on an in-depth research project to explore these vital boundaries and the policies governing them in a selection of school districts. We are really excited to have learned so much in the process, and today I'm joined by Josh Altic, Ballotpedia's Director of Research, to help us wrap our heads around the findings. Josh, thanks for coming on the show.
Of course, happy to be here.
Yeah, I know. I feel like you and I both are very much in the weeds with like a lot of school boards. I typically, when I find myself joining onto the podcast, it's to talk about something school board related, and probably the same goes for you.
Yeah, we've both been focused a lot on elections, so this was kind of a change of pace in the same arena. It was nice.
Yeah. I mean, definitely that's a great kind of segue into the conversation, because we have talked a lot about school districts on this podcast, most of the time about school board elections. But this topic that you've been researching is more on the policy side of things. So just to start, could you give us a general look at this research project and what we were trying to uncover?
Sure. So the basic premise was to look at the policies at a both state level and district level that determined how school districts allocate students to different schools. So how do you decide which school your student gets to go to? And across the spectrum of policy, there's lots of different issues. There's whether parents have a choice or whether it's determined entirely by where they live. What that choice entails in terms of whether you can go across to different districts or to different schools within your own district. And then also how much access you have to various programs that sort of give you different options. So what are the sort of the bureaucratic hurdles you have to overcome? So we were mostly interested in kind of taking a first stab at looking at what those district-specific policies were, because they're kind of a black box. There's not a lot known or compiled about how these lines are even drawn, who determines them, what policies go into drawing these lines. So that's what we were kind of looking at, and we learned a lot and are looking forward to kind of moving forward with that knowledge and expanding the research.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned lines, and this research kind of from my look at it and what I've read about it so far, it deals a lot with lines on the map, from school district boundaries to these things called attendance zones. And I feel like those are two pretty important distinctions. So could you clarify what we're talking about with those terms? What is the difference between a school district boundary and an attendance zone?
Right. So there's two different sets of lines that sort of determine what school your child can go to. One of them is an actual political jurisdiction, the school district. So that's like a city boundary or a county boundary. It represents a lot of different government authority, government jurisdiction, including taxes, including a variety of different facets of that government's authority. But that also determines which schools are in your district and which schools your student can go to. But then within a district, especially large districts that have multiple schools, there are lines drawn that solely determine which school your child can go to. So those are the attendance zone lines. And those are different from the district boundaries. The attendance zone lines cut up a school district into a bunch of different pieces and determine, which piece you are a part of. And each piece has a school that is sort of allocated to it. So those are the lines we're talking about. And we were interested in sort of two policy areas. One, what are the policies that allow you to cross those lines? That's called open enrollment, right? So you have inter-district open enrollment, where you cross from one school district into another school district, usually a neighboring school district, and go to a school outside of your district. And then there's intra-district open enrollment, which is just crossing those little attendance zone lines within your district. So if I live in the zone for Washington High School, can I cross that zone and go to Lincoln High School instead? So those are the two lines we're talking about, and then there's two sets of open enrollment policies that apply to crossing those lines. And then we're also interested, because we're nerds here at Ballotpedia, about how those lines even got there in the first place. Not so much the district boundaries; those are, like I said, government boundaries. But those attendance zones, who draws those maps? Who changes them yearly? Who decides, why does it loop around this neighborhood and through that neighborhood, but cut straight through the other neighborhood? Yeah, how are those decisions made? So that's the attendance zones portion of our research.
That's a really interesting. I mean, yeah, because broadly speaking, one of the things that comes to mind when you talk about these lines, these attendance zones, and how they change. One thing that we also love here about Ballotpedia, but we're not talking about today, is redistricting, right? So the process where you draw new political boundaries to account for population changes. Does it feel like something similar like that happens in these larger schools? I mean, in my school district, there's one high school. So it's one school district, one high school. You don't really have a choice. That's the high school you're going to. But in those larger school districts where you might have a handful of high schools or middle schools that, can kind of be dispersed throughout the city, do they also take into account things like population changes at like a 10-year interval? Or is that more so something where it's like, one school district does it this way, the other school district does it that way?
So the concept of redistricting is all about elections, basically, and vote totals, and how to arrange the voting demographic. And of course, you have the concept of gerrymandering, which is all about strategically arranging that voter demographic. So these attendance zones have nothing to do with elections.
Yeah.
So even some school districts do have sub-districts, which have to do with electing school board members that are representative of a portion of the district.
Yeah, sure. Like you've got the Springfield School District, but maybe District 1 is this corner up here, District 2 is this corner over here, District 3 is down here, and they...
Are called wards or whatever.
Host, whatever, yeah.
These attendance zones, we actually kind of expected there to be some cases where they just overlap, where they use the same boundaries, but they didn't. There's no overlap whatsoever. So these have nothing to do with elections.
Wait. So like in those school districts where you've got the school district and they chop it up into 5 sub-districts for elections. So everyone in Ward 1 votes for a representative on the school board. Everyone in Ward 2 votes for a representative on the school board. But what you're saying is that the attendance zone lines just totally go all around. They don't follow those political lines
whatsoever. That's right.
That's interesting.
So it's the one factor that doesn't play into attendance zone boundaries at all is elections and the voters.
Yeah.
But you have so many others. Like the classical example is like in Friday Night Lights, where there's the sports team, right? So you want all the best athletes to be going to the one high school, not the other high school. So you draw this squiggly, weirdly shaped line to include those residential addresses in your school. And that, we didn't run into a lot of instances of that, but it certainly happens. But more commonly, what you have are residential housing cost concerns, socioeconomic concerns, and in many cases, kind of holdover racial concerns, where there are these quote unquote natural communities that have formed, and there's a lot of pressure to not disturb them. And there's pressure from, like I mentioned the real estate side of things is huge. You have some parents who are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars more for a house as a premium to be near the school that they want their kid to go to. So if all of a sudden you redraw that so that they're no longer in that zone, you can see how those parents might get a little bit upset about that. Yeah. So there's all kinds of these pressures that go into these zones. Pretty much the only one that isn't relevant is elections.
That's super interesting. Well, so like getting like into the policy side of this, when we're talking about these assignments based on residents that you're talking about that we were investigating, we got open enrollment, attendance zone creation, and alteration. We already kind of talked about we've already kind of touched on both of those, but could you, before we kind of jump more deeply into the arguments going on here and the findings that we found here, just really quickly, 1,000-foot view, what is open enrollment? And then what do we mean when we're talking about attendance zone creation and alteration?
Yeah. So open enrollment is, like I said, it's the policy aspect that allows students to jump across those boundaries. So moving from one zone to another. And inevitably they require some kind of application, right? So your parent or guardian has to fill out an application. You have to, in advance, anticipate that you want to move schools or go to a different school. And then you get approved in some way. And then you're able to transition out of the school that you would by default be going to and go to a different school. And so then the type of open enrollment would just depend on which of those boundaries you're trying to cross. Are you trying to cross the attendance zones within your own district?
Mhm.
Or are you actually trying to leave your district and go to a different school district outside of that? So those are the two open enrollment policies we investigated, and we looked at it from a facet of like a range of different facets. From what like I said, what bureaucratic hurdles you have to overcome. So one of the most complicated ones was actually what was the time period you had to apply in. So and something as simple as that. We also looked at the information availability, right? So what information do you need to fill out this application, and could you find that easily? What access problems are there? And then all the different issues that go into it, like transportation. So
Yeah.
some districts said open enrollment's fine, but you have to provide your own transportation. You can't use our bus system to go to a different school, or do you have to pay a tuition fee if you go to a different district? So there's all these different conditions and qualifications, and we looked at each of those and tried to categorize these districts based on their local open enrollment policy.
And what we learned,
cross-reference that with state policy, because there's a lot of state policy on open enrollment as well.
but then one of the things like that it sounds like we learned from that was a lot of these things are left up to the districts, right? Like you have state laws on things like that, but information availability, sometimes a state will say you need to post this here and you need to post it in this format. But a lot of the times when it comes down to like when that information is available, where you can go to find it, that comes down to like how someone sets up a website. So like, did you find that was the case with a lot of these instances where the policy, like the baseline policy might be there, but then when you get down to the actual implementation of the policy, it takes on all sorts of different shapes and forms?
Yeah, so state laws varied a huge amount, and that was sort of our first step, and the research has all been done on that. So we just had to go look at it, and really the state laws fell into kind of 3 or 4 buckets for each type of open enrollment. There were states that mandated open enrollment, right? So districts had to provide open enrollment either inter-district or intra-district. Then there were states that just said, okay, sure, you can do it if you want, but you don't have to. Kind of an opt-in, opt-out situation for the districts. And then there were states that had conditional laws, right? So if your school is a really low performing school, maybe in that case, you're required to provide open enrollment options. And then there were some states that didn't say anything at all, right? So that was kind of a voluntary by silence scenario. But what you said is a great point, is that even in the most well-defined states where the state, like my state of Colorado, mandates that open enrollment be available in all districts, there's still a huge amount of implementation details at the local level. So that could be anything from where they post it, like you said, online, or the information they provide. So take this scenario. Even with the best open enrollment policies, the thing that determines whether you can transfer is still almost always school capacity. Because usually you'll be wanting to transfer from a school that's seen as not as good to a better school. But all the best schools are already at capacity because all the parents want to go to them. So we ran into some states that required districts to post school capacity, but many states didn't, right? So that was kind of up to the school. So if you're a parent thinking, oh, I want to transfer my kid from this school to a different school, maybe you have a short list of 3 schools. You don't know which one to put down in your application because you don't know which one has a room, right? Which one will actually accept you? Or if you apply to it, will they just say, no, we don't have any room. Our classrooms are full. Go away. So the amount of information you have as a parent absolutely dictates how you're able to take advantage of the programs, even the state mandated programs, when it comes to open enrollment.
And then when it comes to like the attendance zone policies and how they work, what do we know about that? Like, what have we learned there? Because from my vantage point, and probably the vantage point with like a lot of listeners, I mean, typically, like you were saying, attendance zone policies really only come into play in larger school districts, and that's kind of like the universe that we were examining for this study. Our sample size was in these larger school districts where things like attendance zone policies might come into play. But obviously, if you live in a smaller school district, you probably don't have to worry about attendance zone policies because you've only got one school to go to. So you don't really get across any of those kind of the attendance zone lines to go anywhere. But in those districts that we did examine, what did we learn about those attendance zone policies and how they work?
Yeah, so our attendance zone research was fueled by this gap we saw. There's been a lot of research into the outcomes of these. So places like Urban Institute or Tim DeRoche has wrote a kind of the seminal work on this, talking about how the effect of these attendance zones has in many cases provided racial segregation. And there's a lot of districts that are actually under desegregation orders still because of these attendance zones. So a lot of the outcomes are there, and a lot of them are showing inequity between, even in the same school district, inequity between two different schools. And it might be the funding that's available to them or simply the quality of education available. And then the people who are going to the good schools want to protect that, and the people who are going to the bad schools don't have the options, right? So there's these fine lines drawn, as the book is called. So that has been kind of a well-known phenomenon, and there's been a lot of research into the negative effects of that, as well as sort of the opportunities there. What we wanted to look at was the inputs, what policies and practices led to these maps being drawn in the first place, and led to them not developing as much over time. A lot of these maps, you look at them now and you look at them from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and they're very, very similar. They're outlining pretty much the same neighborhoods. So is there a case to be made that more changes should be applied to these maps? And if so, what policies are preventing that? Or what policies could be in place? What districts have made a lot of changes or have put into place these policies? So that's what we're looking at, the input side. And as you said, we chose districts where it was relevant. So in the biggest districts is primarily what we looked at. Although attendance zones are relevant as long as you have two schools in your district, there's some kind of boundary that determines this. So we looked at the 45 districts inside of the top 200 largest districts. So that was our universe, and we picked those based on the state laws. So we wanted a smattering of state laws that mandated open enrollment. We wanted a smattering of state laws that gave districts all the options in the world. And so that's how we selected these, and then it was kind of random from there. Mm-hmm. But the attendance zone policies work was difficult. In I think 60-ish% of cases, we actually found published school district policy on attendance zones. But even that was kind of vague sometimes. And what we had to look at was the last time they redrew the zones. So in 30% of cases, we were actually looking at, well, here's the process they used the last time they tried to do this. And I'd love to dive into the details of that, but that's kind of the premise of it is we know about the outputs. We know some of the issues there. What went into designing these maps in the first place, and who's responsible for them?
Yeah, and I think that is, I think that will, one of the things that I'm kind of interested in hearing is, the effect of these policies and or that input side of it as well. What leads into them? What are the outcomes of these policies that exist? But on the topic of like who's drawing these lines, or how often are these lines being drawn, especially when it comes to like attendance zones, because like when I think of like a school district boundary, a school board can't just like sign a piece of paper that says we're expanding our school district to include this area too, because school district boundaries are typically something that the state has to set. And like if a school district is changing its boundary, it's typically encroaching or taking territory from another school district that is a totally distinct political entity. But with these attendance zones, that's all in-house. That's all in a single school district. And so I take it that it's typically the school board or some administrative entity in a school district that kind of decides where those attendance zone lines are.
Yeah, so every state that we looked at 17 different states of the state policy side. Every state gave the school board the authority over student allocation. Mm-hmm. And so in all 45 school districts, that was kind of the status quo, is the school board does have the final say. It was interesting, though, that two of the school districts we looked at were under desegregation orders, And so the court actually drew those maps.
Oh,
They were
interesting.
allowed to draw their own maps. So the district court was responsible for the maps, not the school board. So those were the only exceptions. So 98% of the districts we looked at, the school board was responsible. But what we saw, which I thought was interesting, is that the school board wasn't always the one who was actually making the practical decision. They were often just presented with a map and they rubber stamped it, right? And maybe they gave it consideration, or maybe they went back and had someone change it. But for the most part, what you had was some combination of superintendents, different committees, advisory committees. Some districts, even in the same state, would have a parent advisory committee draw up the map, and the other one would just have a superintendent draw it, right? So there's a lot of variation in terms of who's actually making those decisions. And so that was one of the most interesting things coming out of the research, is we had this laundry list of ideas that different districts used, whether it was surveys or using GPS or using, like I said, a parent advisory committee, or actually hiring a professional in some way to draw these maps. And then does the school board get to look at one map? Do they get to look at 5 different options that accomplish the same thing, and then they choose the best one? So there's a huge amount of variety in terms of the practical aspects of the process that went from, we need to change our zones because we made a new school or the population changed, to here's the map we're going to use.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, about the hypothetical family who spends many $100,000 more so that they can buy a house in a specific attendance zone so their kids can attend a specific school. One of the things that kind of comes to mind when you're talking about the process of drawing these lines or making that decision is input from the community itself. Was that something that we saw playing a role in it? Like, do these happen in meetings that parents can come out to and say things? Because I assume if you're the person who spent a couple $100,000 more for the house, and then you get a letter in the mail that says, "Hey, we're going to change what school you're allocated to," like you said, that parent would probably be not super thrilled about that right off the bat. So it's what is that process like as far as involvement from the people who ostensibly have kind of the most to gain or lose by virtue of these changes happening?
Yeah, most districts held at least 1 or 2 public meetings in advance to kind of air the idea and show some draft maps. We looked at 2 things. What were the inputs beforehand? And then was there a protest process? And we did not find, I think there was one district that had a formal protest process specifically for maps. There were a couple of places that provided general, here's your complaint process. So what we did see in a couple of different cases, was parents who didn't like the map at all. Even after the public input, they came in after the fact and protested it, and actually were able to affect a change, usually back toward the status quo. So yeah, there were angry parents who go in and protest the map. So that happens for sure. But the default public input is just a couple of public meetings before the map is finalized. And I mean, those are attended sparsely, I'll say.
Yeah. I mean, your typical school board meeting, Monday night,
right?
Someone's asleep in the back row. So
yeah. A lot of parents are surprised, I think, when their kids are rezoned.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Well, and I think that gets at sort of what you were saying earlier about the policy might be pretty clear from the state, if the state isn't silent on it, but the policy might be pretty clear from the state, but how it's implemented, how it rolls out, who's noticed, when are they noticed, how are they noticed, is it by mail, is it in a newspaper, public notice, a lot of different variation that can go into how these policies actually play out. One of the things that you touched on a little bit earlier, and you talked about the 2 districts that had desegregation orders. What have we learned about the outcomes of these policies, or what would you say you've kind of taken away in terms of how parents and how communities react to one of these policies being in place versus another one of these policies being in place? For example, I know a family who they say that they don't live in my town because my town has 1 school, so you don't have to worry about it here, like I've mentioned twice now. But they live in a place that has multiple schools, and they list their address as being their grandmother's address because their grandmother lives in the district where that school is that they want to attend, rather than their home address because they don't want to go to that school. What are like the kind of effects that has on how what it is that like parents do, how it is that communities exist? I suppose like in terms of these policies being in
Yeah, that takes many names. On one side of the aisle, people like to call that address sharing, and there's actually been a couple of studies come out recently about to what degree do different school districts and different states prosecute address sharing. And that I think that point illustrates just the length that parents will go, at least some parents, to get their students into the schools that they think will give them an edge, give them a leg up. The other name for that in lots of states is fraud, lying.
Yeah, sure.
So it is illegal in many states, and there are parents who have gone to jail for doing that. And so what we found is that, so our research was more, like I said, on the inputs, and all of those stories went into motivating us to look at this, because when you have parents going to jail because they're so desperate, and when you have these research studies coming out showing that in about 3/4 of the states, these are actual crimes that are being prosecuted, but parents are still saying they live somewhere else. There seems to be an issue there. There's some kind of unrest. There's some kind of problem.
Yeah.
And I think that highlights also the uniqueness of this situation. The public education is one of the only publicly provided services where you're limited in how you participate based on your address, right?
Yeah.
So you take public parks, for example. Most of them, every city I've been to, it doesn't matter where you live. You can go to any park in the city, right? Or
no one's checking your ID before you walk into the park.
And stuff like that, right? So you might not be able to take a book out from the city across from you, right? It might have to be your city, but in your city there might be 5 libraries, and you can go to any one you want.
Yeah.
So most public services are like that. So this is a pretty unique situation. And one of the things we were interested in is, well, why are public schools still using this system when even in the education sector, a lot of different places are using a completely different system. So you look at the charter schools that are popping up, they don't have geographic boundaries that determine their customers, their students. They use like a lottery system or some other system like that. And even in California, the legislature several years back removed this system from the community college level. They said, well, let's get rid of these community college attendance zones and just go based on a lottery, based on attendance, based on first come, first serve, or something like that, instead of saying, if you live here, you have to go to this community college versus that one. And so there are lots of options for allocating students to schools that don't necessarily rely on this, non-overlapping geographic boundaries idea. So but every school uses it. Every district, 3 through 12, uses it. So it's very entrenched. And I think, like I said, there's a lot of pressure from real estate, from teacher unions, from all the powers that be to keep it that way. And there's lots of reasons to keep it that way. So one of them might be that it kind of, the argument is that it strengthens the local school because you have a guaranteed student base for that school, right?
Which is typically how schools are allocated for funding. I mean, state funding formulas typically take into account how many students are attending a school.
So it makes sense to carve up your district and say these students go here, these students go there, especially in a world where the district is providing equitable education across all the schools, right? So if the education's the same, if it's the same quality, then this is an easy way to decide where students go. But when you start looking at some districts where there's some holdover from, say, the red zoning that happened with racially biased mortgage loan stuff, or when you have a road system along which these were drawn that is problematic, and you have a student on one side of the street going to a school that gets 50% less funding because of local property taxes or something like that, then you start to get these highlighted scenarios of inequity across the school district. And that's the driving force behind this conversation. I think it's what people are most concerned about when it comes to this public education promise. And the promise was kind of epitomized by Brown versus Board of Education, this idea that you separation doesn't lead to equity, right? Whether that's along racial lines or socioeconomic lines, you can't really say, well, they're going to be separate and then also be equal. So that's the thought process behind this, for sure.
Well, and that kind of it feels like you kind of have touched on like two sides of different coins, not of the same coin, two different sides of the argument, and that's something that I mean we probably talk like a lot about. But what are some other arguments that have been made in favor to one thing or the other? Like, what are some arguments in favor of making the policies and the lines more permeable, allowing people to move more freely rather than being based on that residential location? Is it mostly like then I'm able to access the school that has the resources that I want for my kids, or are there other arguments that go into that as well?
Yeah. One argument is that allowing the choice, right? And open enrollment speaks to this too, is allowing public school parents choice between schools will actually provide incentive for the schools to sort of have a healthy competition between each other, right?
Oh, sure. I mean, if you're guaranteed...
You're trying to attract students, right? So imagine a grocery store that has a geographic boundary around it, and everyone in that boundary has to go to that grocery store. The grocery store won't have to be worried about its customer base, right?
Yeah.
Because it has guaranteed customers.
And so not only do you have guaranteed customers, but like it's like no one's forcing you to go to the grocery store. Like you could go hungry if you don't go to the grocery store. But like there are laws that require you to go to school, and so like you can't, like it's even more so. Kind of taking that analogy a step further.
Yeah, so that's one argument, is that a rising tide would raise all the boats, and that if you had schools that were concerned about attracting students on a more regular basis, they might implement policies and practices that actually improve the education throughout the entire system. So that's, and looking at, I kind of want to dive into some of the details we found just a little bit. It was one of the conclusions we had was that these attendance zone maps are underdetermined by policy. So there are all of these, basically there are different principles that you're supposed to use, and all the districts had different ones. Few of them were set in state law. Most of them were at the local level. But the policies themselves didn't determine the map. So there's a lot of individual flexibility allowed. And you can draw all kinds of different maps. And there's actually a group of students that created this project that redraws maps that to equalize across certain things, whether it's socioeconomic or racial, or actually even just distance from schools. So they show like, well, here's how it is now. Here's how it could be, following all the same, basically the same rules. But I wanted to, so in the 45 districts, the key thing that all the districts had, almost all, was that it was just about school capacity. And that's the primary function of the attendance zone, is to distribute the students properly across all the different schools. But then you had other ones. So you had other principles, and we categorized these all. And the next most common one, 23 districts out of the 45, was this idea of community, of a natural neighborhood. And that was an interesting one because it's extremely appealing to parents. They love, a lot of parents seem to love the idea of like, oh, everyone in our neighborhood goes to the same school. We all have the same high school flag up. There's this like kind of lifeblood of the community sort of feel to it.
Yeah.
And so that's all great. And that all feels good and works well and integrates the school with the community. But then there's the other issue, in that these natural communities are often the lines drawn are real estate lines, or poverty lines, or wrong side of the tracks sort of lines. And then you get these scenarios where there's a lack of equity, both in terms of funding and quality on one side versus the other. So that was almost like a double-edged sword in terms of and like I said, it was the next most common articulated policy on how to draw these maps. The next most common one was transportation.
Which I feel like we should pause. Is it seems like a kind of hard thing to articulate at the end of the day. Like when it comes down to like define, I feel like I've seen examples of this, of people like having a city and they're like, circle or draw out the line of where you think this community is or where this neighborhood is. And people will all have very different lines, kind of trying to describe the same thing. So it's not really a concrete, like community is not really a concrete.
There's a lot of subjectivity there for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's what I mean by that's an aspect of what I mean by undetermined or underdetermined, right? Is that you still have whoever's drawing these lines still has a lot of discretion. The next one isn't quite as arbitrary, but it's transportation.
Okay.
So a lot of these districts have kind of defined bus routes already, and they don't really want to mess with those bus routes, or there's just a clear way in which the transportation works best, and so they actually base the attendance zones on the transportation system. So that was one, and then there were 13 out of the 45 that actually had provisions that we classified as diversity or equity related provisions. So those 13 districts actually took into consideration, well, let's try to make these equitable in terms of keeping the attendance zones diverse racially and socioeconomically. And then there were 7 that had requirements about frequency, right? So this addresses the idea of parents not wanting their student to be rezoned like 50 times.
Sure.
And so some of them had the requirement that, a single student couldn't be rezoned more than twice throughout their K through 12 year, whatever. Or the principle was just to minimize the number of rezoning efforts. So, and then there was one district that had actually a state provided, but a specific one. It was for this specific district. The state law said that you couldn't base anything on rezoning based on race. So you couldn't take race into consideration at all.
Wait, so the state passed a law that said this single
particular district
cannot do that.
It was in Georgia, yeah. So that it was almost like an anti-equity
like kind of the flip side of what those other 7.
You can't consider this at all. You have to use the other criteria. So looking at those are the categories we put them in. And like I said, I think the key takeaways were A, these are underdetermined, and B, there's an interesting the 2 most common ones kind of have this double-edged sword idea to them, where there's something good that they're accomplishing, but there's also the danger of it being extremely detrimental long term and preventing kind of equitable efforts from moving forward and having this penchant towards staying with the status quo and not affecting change through these zones.
Well, I suppose that that's another one of the arguments said in favor of making the lines a little bit more fluid or being able to cross them more freely is to kind of get around some of those items at the very top.
Yeah, I think that's right. And like there were I think there's like a handful of attendance zones in the country that actually overlap. And that was an interesting idea to me. We didn't find any in these districts.
Wait. So it's like the zones where it's like if you live in here, you go to this school, they'll actually overlap with each other. So you could find yourself living in a place where you could go to like either school.
Exactly right. So
you do have a choice in that situation,
and you have a choice by default as opposed to having a school by default, and then maybe an avenue to choice if there's an option, right?
Yeah,
that's a really interesting idea to me because there's no government authority or jurisdiction aspect to these, like there is with the district boundary. So why are they all exclusive? Why do they create a patchwork of exclusive regions across the country? Why not draw them so every attendance zone has 3 schools? And then you use a first come, first serve or a lottery system or whatever you want to decide those. Yeah. Because sometimes the school, we saw some cases where the school you were zoned for wasn't even the closest school to you. It might not have even been the 3rd closest school to you because of how these zones are.
It's like maybe a squiggly line that goes off a couple miles this way, and you're just at the end of that line, so you actually have to drive all the way over here to go to school. Right. You can't go to that one.
And the natural neighborhood just happened to end right next to the school as opposed to farther away from it, right? So you might live really close to a school, but not be zoned for that school. So there's stuff like that I think it makes sense when you look at the details for how it exists and why, because it's a lot simpler to allocate one student to one school. There's and to make them, geographically distinct. But there's no actual reason why they couldn't overlap, or that you couldn't just use a GPS metric. So, any school that GPS tells you you're 20 minutes from,
that's fair game.
Designed for those, and then you pick based on some other criteria, whether it be, like I said, a lottery system or something else. So, and the mystery to me is that problem's already been solved, right? There's a whole system of schools, the magnet schools, the charter schools,
that operate with
use a lottery system or use some other, like first come first serve, some other way of determining which students can go there. So it's fascinating to me to see that these lines have existed for so long. The system is still going strong, and there's so much resistance to really changing it. Even though, and I'll say this last thing, it's the school board so we looked at, I pulled up the actual numbers. So we were looking at 17 different states for this pilot. We want to do all of them as soon as possible. But in 4 of those states, there was no state law mentioning these geographic zones at all. And then in 4 of the states, there was like an implicit authorization to use zones.
Yeah.
But it wasn't required. So like in Florida, for example, the state law says something like the school board shall determine student allocation, where students should go, student enrollment, and they can use geographic zones. It says that they don't have, right? So even the state law is kind of allowing for this.
Yeah, it's like if you want to do a lottery, you could do a lottery, but you could also use geographic zones.
In some states, and then there were 4 states that dictated geographic zones.
You
even
have to do it this way.
So it's kind of a mix. It was like almost a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 mix-ish. And then the rest of them just didn't say anything about it and didn't require it or forbid it. So there's a lot of options available to these school boards that no one's using because it's just not done. It's just the public school way is to use these attendance zones. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. And then one of the goals of this research, I think, is to start getting a much larger data set.
Yeah.
And being able to cross-reference all these specific policies, these district-specific policies, with some of the most atrocious outcomes, and say, all right, is there a principle or a policy being used that just so happens
to end up
in some of the worst cases? And then you look at the ones that are good, the ones that are doing great, the ones where the attendance zones make sense. What principles are there? So are there some patterns there? And then highlighting the fact that these aren't really that necessary. They just exist. And if I were a school board member, it would just be a huge headache to do away with this system that has worked for so long, right?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and especially when it comes to kind of basically like you talked about some of the arguments, like on one side of making the lines a little bit more fluid, but then the arguments on the other side of keep them a little bit more concrete are kind of in the realms of sort of what we've been talking about throughout, of like people make life decisions, like monumental life decisions, like some of the biggest purchases they ever make in their entire life, they make with the idea of an attendance zone at like the forefront of their mind. And then to just kind of like upend that would probably make people unhappy, to say the least. Knowing what we know about watching and following some conversations in front of school boards, the ones that aren't sleepy, I'm sure that plays into some of the political sort of like pushback that you would feel if a board were to, if a board in Florida were to say, actually, we don't need to use these zones at all. Like the state law allows us to do whatever we want. Well, if they like started to go down that path, then I'm sure they would hear from a lot of constituents very quickly about why they shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that the goal moving forward is to take in as many more states as possible and cross-reference that. I mean, that sounds great to me. Are there any other like policy aspects that you want to catalog? Or I mean, like you mentioned those instances of like overlapping attendance zones. Are there any other things that you're kind of like looking out for in terms of things that maybe we didn't see or weren't able to take a look at too much with this sample set, but we might be able to get a better idea about in like a larger sample set?
Yeah, one of the goals with this small pilot was to just prove feasibility. Could we actually find these policies or dig up the old meeting documents that had the practices from the previous rezoning? And so proving feasibility, being able to find that for all the 45 districts was really encouraging. Yeah, but there are now a bunch of patterns that kind of appear, that we could see appearing, and that we know anecdotally exist, and we want to go put data behind them, right? So if we could do 1,000 districts, and so going back to the open enrollment side, one of the patterns we saw, or that has been purported and that was borne out in this particular research, even though it was a small sample size, was this pattern of large urban districts that have open enrollment. They've opted into open enrollment. They're fine with it. But then what you have is a smattering of surrounding suburban districts, often with the preferred schools, and they have opted out of open enrollment. They don't want students coming from other districts into their districts. So you have this sort of donut-shaped hole or shape of districts that are saying, well, no thanks, we'll just keep our own students and not really accept any students for this transfers. And that, of course, relates to inter-district open enrollment, kind of crossing those district lines. So seeing that pattern, seeing if that pattern kind of bears out over a much larger
like other
sample,
cities
really
or other large areas.
Because like in the just the ones we did, we kind of took a look at the districts, all large districts, usually urban districts, and we looked at I took a brief look at the surrounding districts, the best ones, and so 60% of the districts we looked at had really no generally available interdistrict transfer options outside of the district to a surrounding highly rated district. So, maybe there were options if, like a lot of the conditions in place were like, oh, if your parent works at the school, then sure, you can come. Or if you pay tuition, you can come. Or if you were abused at your school, you can come, or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
but typically things that are either not super common or are prohibitive. Paying tuition to send your kid to like a public school is something that I'm sure a lot of families can't just like do, especially if you have multiple kids. And so like it's effectively kind of like what you're saying of like that donut hole shaped sort of like wall, sort of like off.
Bringing us back to kind of the socioeconomic access issue too, right? If you're having to pay tuition or even provide your own transportation to these districts that are, or these schools that are 35, 40 minutes away, that can be a prohibitive impediment to, some people, while not to others. But other things we looked at, which districts mandated clear and objective standards for determining capacity. Yeah. Because the other thing a school can do is even if open enrollment is mandatory, right? No open enrollment law at the state level said, oh, you have to accept students no matter what. The open enrollment policies always gave precedence to the students in their attendance zones. Sure. And B, they could always say, well, we just don't have seats. We don't have enough room. So we found that 56% of districts did not have any sort of objective standard for capacity. It was just like the superintendent said so,
like
or
a
the principal
vibe.
said so, right?
We feel full. Yeah.
It turns out our parents like smaller class sizes, so we're going to stick to 12. So it was kind of this vague, and it's such a core policy area.
Like the number one thing
of open enrollment.
Yeah.
It's really permanent. So those are the types of patterns we kind of want to really look at as we expand this out and look at more districts. Hopefully across all the states, so the entire country, and at least 1,000 districts is what we're hoping to do soon.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that sounds exciting. And when you do that, I'm sure we'll be back here to chat more about the different patterns and things that you find. But I mean, listeners, if you're interested in learning more about this research and diving into some of these patterns that were found and the data that was found, you can check out the link in the show notes. But Josh, thank you so much for your time today. It was great. It was great chatting with you. Yeah. Thank you for having me on. Yeah. And for our listeners, we'll be back next week with another episode. So make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Doug Kroneisel, and thanks for listening.